Assalamu alaikum everyone, and a warm welcome to you all, and welcome to the second day of Islamic Awareness Week. I present to you, inshallah, Sheikh Wesam Charkawi to talk about the God solution, in contrast with the recent book, well not the recent book, sorry, by Richard Dawkins, The God Delusion. Inshallah he can expound on our theory on why Allah exists. Inshallah, and there will be a Q&A after.
Yeah, Q&A.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you. You hear me? Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulillahi wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Amma ba'd. Given this talk is going to be outside today, there's going to be a lot of distractions. So this type of talk is such that it's going to take require your undivided attention. So as much as you can really sort of take in the arguments that we're going to pose today, try and focus as much as possible. I think that would be to your benefit, inshallah tabarak wa ta'ala. There are a few arguments that when we talk about whether or not does God exist, people often make the arguments sometimes why he doesn't exist. What we want to make the argument today is we want to present to you some of the arguments of why God does exist. And there are good reasons to believe that God indeed does exist. And after we finish from today's arguments, you'll find that this is unquestionable. This will be an unquestionable result that we will arrive at. I want to start by saying, or by getting into the first argument, which many have probably heard, but maybe not in the way that I'm going to put it today, inshallah. It's called the fine-tuning argument. The fine-tuning argument. The fine-tuning argument is an argument where we look at certain things in the world and we say that there are certain markers about how things are. Certain markers and certain points about why things the way they are. If we look at, for example, about what Stephen Hawking said, he was talking about the rate of the universe's expansion. And he said that after the Big Bang, I'll just give you an example about fine-tuning. He said after the Big Bang, if the rate of the expansion of the universe was smaller by 1,000 million, he said if the rate of the expansion of the universe right after the Big Bang was smaller by 1,000 million, the universe would have collapsed in and upon itself in a hot fireball. Yeah, this is just an example about astronomical numbers. Unbelievable improbability. We have Paul Davies who talks about the star formation. This is again the fine-tuning argument. How things are very specific. They have very specific markers about them that indicate intelligence. Paul Davies, he calculated the initial conditions about star formation. And he said that with respect to star formation, and he calculated the particular number of the fine-tuning that was required. And he said you need a 1. You need a 1 followed by 1,000 billion zeros. You need a 1 followed by 1,000 billion zeros. Paul Davies is an expert. He's a PhD scholar. He wasn't here long ago. There are 50 such quantities and constants in relation to the Big Bang. About this, 50 such constants just in relation to the Big Bang, about massive astronomical numbers. 1 followed by 1,000 billion. So the fine-tuning argument comes down to a few things. When we look at for example, the cosmos, and we look at the universe, there's 3 possibilities. Either it happened because of a natural law. This is really where you need to focus. Either because it happened because of a natural law, it happened because of chance, or it happened because it was by design. So because the natural law, so some people say, physics and things the way they are, that's just the way they are. Things are the way they are because they're necessary to be the way they are. That's just how it is. We don't know the theory of it. We can't explain the theory about it, but it's necessary that things are the way they just are. We're going to talk about this in depth. Then we have the second option, that everything happened by chance. It was just a complete, utter accident. It just happened to be the case. It was a chance happening and it occurred. And the second one, or the third alternative, is that it happened by design, And this is a rejection of the first two. That there was a creator, a designer, and an architect of all that you see who was responsible for all the fine-tuning that we'll talk about. Now, in respect to the first alternative, or the first principle, where they talk about natural law, and they argue that the laws of nature are necessary. Things must be just the way they are. They just have to be like that. We want to eradicate this principle straight away. First and foremost, Paul Davies, he makes a really detailed analysis of this, and he says that if you say that things are the way they are, the conditions of physics are the way they are, he said this does not explain the initial conditions of what we have now. And I want to quote him, and what he says there is nothing present in the current ideas that we have about laws of initial conditions remotely to suggest that their consistency with the laws of physics would imply uniqueness. But this is the point I really want to get to. He says, it seems then, this is really what I want you to stick in your mind, it seems then that the physical universe does not have to be the way it is, and it could have been otherwise. It could have been otherwise. So you see now the argument of natural law that things just must be the way they are, that they're mandated and necessary to be like that. It's very unscientific. It's not really a strong argument, and it's very unscientific, and many scientists don't hold that, but I put it there just to show you that there are three alternatives. So we get now to the second point in terms of chance. Can everything that we see today, can this cosmos and universe be by a sheer chance? Before we even get into the sort of, the details of this, let's look at it. If you were to apply this, a hypothesis in your life, if you were to say that everything in my life happens by chance, you wouldn't be able to live. You actually wouldn't be able to live. You wouldn't be able to justify anything. You wouldn't be able to justify, for example, how the car is parked in your driveway overnight. What, did it happen by chance? You couldn't make sense of anything if you just applied this hypothesis in your life. But there's a difference between chance and pattern. Something which is a pattern and something which is chance, there's definitely a difference. Let me give you an example about a chimpanzee. If we say we left, the famous story, you left the chimpanzee in a room, and you came back and the chimpanzee typed up just whatever it typed up, and it typed up a gibberish that didn't make sense. We would say there's no pattern here. What it did was via chance. If we came the next day and it typed up Shakespeare, what we would say is that it followed a unique grammatical structure. It actually followed something which is pattern. There's a specific unique pattern about it which indicates intelligence. It couldn't have happened by a sheer chance that a chimpanzee would type up something which adheres to the laws and patterns of the grammatical structure of English. So you see now there's a definite difference between chance and something which is pattern. Now, William Dembski, who was a professor of biology and physics, he actually spoke about this principle called specified complexity. Specified complexity. And he said, in life in general, there are specific identifiable markers. Now, when he said specific identifiable markers, think of fingerprints for an investigator. Specific identifiable markers in things that you can't see, and sometimes you can see. Now, when he said specific identifiable markers, think of fingerprints for an investigator. For them, it's an indicator that something indeed was there. Now, when he starts to speak about specified complexity, again, it's something where there's a pattern. There's a pattern about it. He says that this thing is, when we speak about specified complexity, he says we're not talking about something that occurs naturally, but rather it occurs in the universe that wasn't previously there. We give an example about this specified complexity. He says, for example, you find that something is produced naturally. You have metal, you have maybe rubber, you have maybe a pin, you have all these things that are very separated and produced by nature. But if we said we now have a watch, this is something that has been produced that wasn't there by nature. This is what Dembski referred to as specified complexity. Now, when you have specified complexity, they are specific identifiable markers. This has nothing to do with chance. So specific complexity. Then we have irreducible complexity. Michael Behe wrote a book. The book that Michael Behe wrote was called Darwin's Black Box. This is a very, very good book for anybody who wants to know about evolution and what the facts of evolution are. And he's a professor in biology, and he wrote a book called Darwin's Black Box. Whoever hasn't read that book, I really encourage you to read that book. And he spoke about this point called irreducible complexity. He spoke about it and he said that when you look at, for example, things at a very deep level, he said there are very intricate parts all tied together that function. He said if you take away one of those parts, he said that whole thing ceases to function. He called it an irreducible core. So irreducible complexity is something that you can't work your way up to achieve that function. It must be via design. So when we look at now whether this chance hypothesis is actually a credible solution to God, when we put specified complexity, which are pattern markers, irreducible complexity, plus the astronomical numbers, 1,000, one followed by 1,000 billion. When we're talking about improbability of that nature, we now see that chance has no credible foundation to lay its case. When we look at it in that regard, we have, in terms of some people and some of the atheists, what they'll argue, they'll say, but what about the many worlds or the many universes hypothesis? Now, some of the atheists or atheism claim that there's a many worlds hypothesis. There's this universe that exists. We are just one amongst a greater collection of universes. That's what they say. And they say they're not potential. They're actually real. So they say there's many universes out there. We're just one of them. And we're not saying that they can exist, but rather that they do exist. So they have this hypothesis. Again, they're laying it on the basis of chance. But in reality, this is not science. And I'll tell you why. John Polkinghorne, he says, again, and he's a physicist, and I'll quote him, he says, people try to trick out a many-universe account in sort of pseudo-scientific terms. He says, but that's pseudoscience. It's not real science. It's like child science. He said it is a metaphysical guess. It's nothing but a guess. So those people, particularly the atheists who will try and claim out this hypothesis that there's a many universes theory and that we just happen to be one amongst all of them, and that's how we come to exist. In reality, according to the experts, they're saying that it is nothing but a metaphysical guess, and nothing but a metaphysical guess that there might be many universes with different laws and circumstances. So again, you see that it's filled with problems and complexities which you can't base science upon. You can't base science upon. Nobody can look outside this universe to know whether there's many universes. So you have problems. In reality, the design hypothesis is easy. It's simple. A maker, an architect, created all that. You see, it's simpler. It's far simpler. Now, who's heard of Occam's razor? Who's heard of Occam's razor? Anybody heard of Occam's razor? Occam's razor, he had this philosophical point, and he said that we should not multiply causes. I want you to listen carefully. We should not multiply causes beyond what is necessary to explain the effect. Let me say that again. Occam's razor basically says that you should not multiply causes beyond what is necessary to explain the effect. In other words, inference to the best explanation. If there's a better explanation, that's what we take. So you shouldn't multiply causes unnecessarily. Now you're now saying that we have this multiple world theory, many worlds theory, and you've got all these theories coming along. So when we have a look at design versus an infinite bloated collection of universes, what we say is the design concept is far simpler. It's far simpler. And according to Occam's razor, you should not multiply the causes beyond what is necessary, and it's not necessary. It's not science, and you can't look outside this universe to know whether or not there are many universes or not. So what we have now, we have a situation. In the absence of independent evidence of what they say, of this multi-universe or many universes theory, they are guilty. You know what they're guilty of? And if there's any atheist listening, you're guilty actually of the inverse gambler's fallacy. It's called the inverse gambler's fallacy. Now, the inverse gambler's fallacy is the attempt to render an event more probable by hypothesizing the existence of a previous series of unsuccessful throws of the dice. See what it is? I'll read that again. Inverse gambler's hypothesis. It's a gambler's hypothesis. What it is the attempt to render an event more probable. You're trying to say this event is more probable by assuming or imagining the existence of a previous series of unsuccessful throws of the dice. So because you've had more unsuccessful attempts, you're trying to hypothesize what the outcome's going to be. So the cosmic the cosmic design, which is that this universe was created by an architect and being, is free of this fallacy. It's free of this erroneous concept. And we see there are many other arguments for the existence of God. We're going to cover them. I don't want to take too long because I want to leave Q&A at the end. But Richard Dawkins, he said, anybody who doesn't know who Richard Dawkins is, well, at the end of the day, he wrote a book called God's Delusion, or God Delusion. In that book, he was trying to disprove, obviously, the existence of God, and his arguments were extremely weak. I read the whole book and was looking for the most powerful arguments that Dawkins had in his book. On page 159, Dawkins says, it's very important, because he's at the moment, he's looked at as one of the foremost ardent advocates of atheism. This is Richard Dawkins. He says, but all the arguments that the people of theism demonstrate, they can't explain who created the designer. They can't explain the designer. They can't tell me who explained the designer. That's his catchphrase. But how do you explain God? Where's your explanation for God? But see, it's very important here. There's a fallacy here. There's a fallacy which is very easy to spot. You know what the fallacy is? The fallacy is, if every single explanation, I want you to pay attention to this. If every single explanation required a further explanation, you would have an infinite regress of explanation, and you would never be able to explain anything. And the job of a scientist is to provide an explanation. So if you keep after an explanation, and you want an explanation of the explanation of the explanation, you have an infinite regress of explanation, and you'll never end up explaining anything. Whose job it is to explain something, because you're a scientist, you need to explain something. So if you take that concept, but who explains the designer, then the fallacy is very easy to see. If you want an explanation, you're going to keep after an explanation. But science is such that you provide an explanation. But what about if we sought an explanation of the explanation, and an explanation of the explanation of the explanation, and we kept going? You would have an infinite regress of explanations and would never end up explaining anything. Does that make sense? Yeah, everybody get it? Good. All right. So science also claims that things, they look at the situation that they must be repeatable, but the designer, he performs things which are very unique events. So we can't repeat them. Science is making this claim that we can't repeat that which you're claiming because God has created it miraculously, therefore we can't repeat it. But according to this claim, science is therefore, what they're saying by this is that, well, they deal with things which are always repeatable. That's not the case. If we look at what they call science now, they say, they talk about the evolution and the origins of life, and you share a common ancestor. But they can't repeat the origin of life. It's not repeatable, yet they're calling it science. They're calling it a fact, in fact. And most of the scientific community is yanking on this chain of a common ancestor evolution in that regard. And we believe at the end of the day in microevolution, but not macroevolution. We believe that there can be change within a species, but not from species to species. And that's the difference between macro and microevolution. But what they're saying here is that we can't accept your hypothesis of a designer because it's not repeatable. That's what science is making that claim. But science itself is dealing in things which aren't repeatable. You're talking about the origin of life, but you can't repeat it. But also you can't repeat the Big Bang, and yet you're calling it science. And yet it's in the realm of science. So that just shows to you what the claims are. I don't want to spend too much on that topic. I want to really get down to the nitty-gritty. I'm saving the best for last. That got away. All right. Now, you know the only thing that makes sense of this universe? The only thing, stop playing with your phone, listen. The only thing which makes sense of this universe, you know what it is? God. And I'm not just trying to make an outlandish claim. It is actually, he's the only one that makes sense of this universe. I'm going to tell you why. The atheist will claim, because he has to get away from the fact that this universe began. He needs to hold on to the fact that there must be an eternal universe. It must be eternal because something needs to be eternal. Let me give you an example. Let me just give you one example. If I said to you, and I had a beginning, I was created. If I said to you that I can't put my hand up unless I take the permission of this person next to me, and the person next to me can't put his hand up unless he takes the permission of someone next to him. And he can't put his hand up unless he takes the permission of somebody next to him. And nobody can put their hand up unless they need to take the permission of somebody before them. If that keeps going forever, nobody will ever put their hand up. So likewise, we are created beings who began. If we also ensued from another created being, who also began in time, and that kept going and going and going and going, if that doesn't stop somewhere, you don't have a creation. You're not created. So the atheist said, well, this universe must be eternal. So he's trying to sort of swivel his way out of the problem. But what we say is, if you say this universe is eternal, you've got a big problem. If you say this universe is eternal, you have an infinite regress of past events. Let me give you an example about this. Let me give you an example. If I say I have an infinite regress of past events, I just want to really blow something out of the water quickly. If I say this universe is eternal, let me give you an example. If I said to you, Saturn does 1 revolution around the sun, and by the time Saturn does 1 revolution, Jupiter does 2. If Saturn does 1 million revolutions around the sun, Jupiter has done 2 million. If we kept going forever, we would say that Jupiter would be infinitely faster and Saturn would be infinitely slower. But if I said to you now that we have an eternal past, an infinite past, okay, there's no beginning for it, it always was. What you're actually saying now, who's faster, Jupiter or Saturn? Well, they're both infinite. It leads to an absurdity. It's absurd. You're talking about infinite, yet one is greater than the other. So if you say that this universe is eternal, you have an infinity of past events. But it doesn't make sense. Let me give you another example. If I said to you I had 1,000,000 marbles, if I said to you I had infinite marbles, I have an infinity of marbles, and I add 2, what am I left with? Infinity. If I said to you I have an infinite number of marbles, and I subtract 2, what am I left with? Infinity. You see, the results are absurd, they're self-contradictory, they don't make sense. They don't make sense at all. So if you say this universe is infinite, it actually leads to absurdities. But what's more, we get into this argument where it's an argument that was posed by one great Muslim thinker. His name was Imam al-Ghazali. He said, very good argument. He said, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Whatever begins to exist, I wish I had a PowerPoint as a visual aid. But whatever begins to exist has a cause. Take me as an example. I began to exist, I have a cause. The universe did begin to exist, that's a fact. The scientific community, in fact, Stephen Hawking, he said that almost everyone now believes that this universe came into being through the Big Bang. Almost every scientist believes now that the universe came into existence through the Big Bang. So whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. Now if the universe has a cause, that's a very powerful argument. I'll say it again. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. True. If it began to exist, someone caused it to exist. True. The universe began to exist. True. Therefore the universe has a cause. True. But if the cause of this universe is someone like you and I, it will never come to exist. So therefore the cause has to be eternal, timeless, changeless, can't be like you and I. And this is God. That's why God is the only answer to this universe. There's no other answer. How do you explain it? You can't. You can't explain it through any other way other than God. This is really what it comes down to. Now sometimes some scientists will say, and I really just want to get a little bit technical. Just a little bit technical. They'll argue and say, but your first premise of that, whatever begins to exist has a cause. They'll say that sometimes at the sub-quantum level. Now, whoever doesn't know what I'm talking about, go look it up, research it. It's a very interesting argument. They'll say sometimes at the sub-quantum level, there are things that happen. There are things that happen without a cause. This is called indeterminism. They'll tell you. Sometimes things at the sub-quantum level, at the really deeper level, they happen without a cause. So therefore, your premise is false. No, the premise is not false, and I'll tell you why. The scientists are saying that the particles that you see happening at the sub-quantum level don't come out of nothing. They come out of a vacuum. And the vacuum that they come out of at the sub-quantum level is fleeting with energy. You often have today popular scientists or magazines come in and saying this universe came out of nothing. The nothing that you're talking about is actually something. The nothing that you're talking about is actually filled with energy. The nothing that you're talking about is not actually nothing, it's actually something. So when you say we came out of nothing, it's a complete erroneous fallacy. The universe that you see when you look outside, don't think that it's just void of anything. It's a vacuum. And the vacuum is filled with energy. So you can't just make this claim that it came out of nothing. No, it came out of something. So you can't say that it didn't have a cause. These atoms at the subquantum level, that these things just emanate without a cause. No, they have a cause. They came out of the vacuum. And not everybody agrees with what they said. That was the Copenhagen Agreement. There was a physicist by the name of David Bohm. And David Bohm was he's a foremost renowned physicist who said that we do not believe in the concept of indeterminism or the Copenhagen argument the way they put it. It's a very detailed argument. In order to really go through it, I'd really need a slideshow so you guys can get some visual aids. So I'm not going to bother going through everything. All right. The universe began to exist. You know how we said whatever begins to exist has a cause? The universe began to exist. Someone will say, but I can give you an example of there are actual infinite things in society, in life. The atheist will come and he'll pose this argument and say, there are things which are infinite. Let me prove it to you. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way potentially to infinity. You could keep going, you would never stop. But what these people don't understand is this is a potential infinite, not an actual infinite. You would be seen to be approaching infinity, but you'd never actually get there. So that's a potential infinite, not an actual infinite. Not an actual infinite in reality. So if you actually say that the actual infinite number of things exist, what you're actually violating is the rules of transfinite arithmetic. Like I was saying to you before, if I had an infinite number of apples and I take away 2 apples, what am I left with? Infinity. An infinite number of apples plus 2 apples, what am I left with? Infinity. You're actually violating these rules. So we'll move on. I don't want to get too long. I'll leave you some Q&A. All right. The last argument that I want to make, particularly about this, about the argument in terms of whether or not God exists, is the moral argument. Well, we've already said that if you say that this universe is eternal, you have the problem of an infinite regress, and it can't be explained through an infinite regress. And again, I'll just summarize. Richard Dawkins, the atheist, who said, and his most powerful argument was that you can't explain the desire. And again, I encourage you to read the book Michael Behe wrote, Darwin's Black Box. It was really, at the molecular level, really, evolution cannot explain for things at that level. And I really encourage you to read it. He really did take Richard Dawkins apart. Professor Michael Behe really did take Richard Dawkins apart. But Dawkins says, who explains the design? Again, just to recap, if you require an explanation for God, or an explanation of the designer, the fallacy is, an explanation requires an explanation. If you keep going, it's an infinite regress of explanation. But let's get into our final argument, which is the moral argument. This is a very, very strong argument, a very useful argument. And the argument is, if God does not exist, then the object moral values don't exist. That's the reality. Object moral values don't exist if God doesn't exist. What do I mean by objective? Objective, not subjective. Subjective is personal. I mean objective moral values. I mean values that are binding. Values that are valid. Whether you believe in them or not, they still exist. I mean, for example, if we look at the Holocaust, was objectively wrong. The Holocaust was objectively wrong. Whether you believe that the people who carried it out, whether they thought it was right or whether they convinced the world that it was right, whether they'd won World War II, regardless of what had occurred, that it would still be objectively wrong regardless of the outcome and regardless of how they tried to convince the world. This is what I'm talking about. That something is fundamentally wrong about it, or something is fundamentally binding and known to be right. So we know that abuse is wrong. We know, for example, hurting people is wrong. It's binding, it's valid, it's objective. Because if God doesn't exist, you don't have that objectivity then, you have subjectivity. It becomes subjective, not objective. There's an argument that Stephen Meyer, and he documents in his book, and it's a very valid argument. Stephen Meyer, he says that the existence of God the existence of God provides the only coherent explanation. The only coherent explanation. The only explanation that makes sense of the necessary conditions of an objective morality. So only if a person believes in God that you can make sense of what is right and what is wrong. Only if you believe in God. And you know, if you look at the actions of the people, if we look at people today and what they're doing, you know, there's a presupposition. There's actually a presupposition that there is an objective moral code. There's actually a presupposition that there's an objective moral code, and that people are living by and according and making their lives accord with. There's a presupposition that God exists. And what we mean by that is people, they presume that God exists, and then they cater their life to meet that objective moral code. There was a philosopher, Voltaire, who said, if God did not exist, we should have to invent him. He said, if God didn't exist, we'd have to invent him. Why would we have to invent him? Because we need that, because it was realized that objective morality or moral code it's not fathomable without God. So we also look at some of the arguments in this regard that, and when we look at human necessary beliefs, that and what they believe, they only are deemed true with their belief in God. Now there was one man who said, and he was a philosopher, he said, if God is dead, then all things are permissible. True. If God is dead, you think about this, if God is dead, if God doesn't exist, all things are permissible. Who would agree with that? If God doesn't exist, then all things would be permissible. Who would agree with that? Right? Put your hands up, don't be shy. Who would agree? Wouldn't all things be permissible? Everything would be on the table. If God was dead, if God did not exist, everything would be permissible. Everything would be allowed. Whatever whim and desire you had, you would be able to undertake that desire without fear, without apprehension, without hesitation. If God was dead. But I want to ask you a question. Do people act according to a manner or according to a way that everything is permissible? Do people act like that? Do people act like everything is permissible? No, of course they do not. Therefore, people are living as though God is alive and though God exists. So you see, people presuppose that God is living, and without God, you can have no objective morality. That is the fundamental case at the end of the day. Are people acting like everything is permissible? No, so you see that there's this presupposition that God definitely exists. Now, if a person didn't believe, if we said that a person, he doesn't have a belief in God, you know what we all are? If we don't have that God consciousness, and if we don't accept that God exists, you are walking, talking contradictions. You're walking, talking contradictions. You know why? Because you can't say that's right. You can't say that's wrong. You're not allowed to. If at any time you say that that is wrong, you can't do that. You're making an objective judgment. You're making a moral judgment. You're making a moral judgment. And if we say that at the end of the day, all things are permissible, but now you're making a moral judgment. So if you actually say that God doesn't exist, you are walking, talking contradiction. You will not be able to tell anybody that this is moral or this is immoral. This just becomes something very subjective. It comes down to personal opinion. It comes down to what you accept as a personal being, but that actually there's no moral objective code. But everybody feels it, don't they? Everybody knows what those binding elements are. Everybody feels what those binding elements are. Whether you belong to this faith or whether you belong to that faith, whether you belong to Judaism, Christianity, Islam, you actually believe that you feel that there's a binding code. Because that's your belief in God. You're presupposing that's the case. Now, in this regard, in terms of moral objectivism, there has to be a transcendent standard. A standard. There has to be a standard which is above the standard of the people. And only when we believe that the ethical norms are appropriate to apply and that we have a choice in that we'll do. Let me give you an example. If I said to you that something happened to a particular person, and let's say, it was a very unfortunate thing, but the person had no choice in the matter, you would look at it in a completely different manner. But if a person has a choice in the matter, and he doesn't adhere to those binding things which you know to be the case, you will say the person has breached that transcendent standard which normally we know that he should apply to. So there is, in terms of moral objectivism, there needs to be a standard in which people can apply to. there also needs to be a free will. You need to have a free will in order to be able to choose whether to embark upon it or not. Now, evolution or naturalism or materialism, they have this concept that everything that occurs, you don't have any free will in the matter. Or nihilism, they say you don't have a choice in the matter. So there are certain things that occur, you have no choice in the matter. This comes out to materialism or naturalism. Now Stephen Jay Gould, he said, this is very, very important, he said matter is the ground of all existence. Matter is the ground of all existence, mind, spirit, and God as well. And they are just words that express the wondrous results of neuronal complexity. Neuronal complexity, that's all. That's all. We can't explain the things that are occurring. Basically, it's just matter. It's matter, but there's no free will. God and everything you see, it's just a neuronal complexity. That's all it's about. There's another one, William Provine, he said that human free will doesn't exist. Human free will doesn't exist. He said free will is a disastrous and mean social myth. And he was a PhD in history of biology. He was a PhD in history of biology. He said that free will is a disaster and mean social myth. He then said it's cruel of society to prosecute criminals. It's cruel of society to prosecute criminals. That's a bit rich that on the one hand you say they have no free will, and then you said it's cruel. By saying it's cruel, you're making a moral judgment. You're making a moral judgment. That's what we're talking about. Moral objectivity. Without God, it doesn't exist. So you see these arguments in totality, they definitely are very potent arguments, very strong arguments that God exists. And to say that God doesn't exist actually is very erroneous and very fallacious, and the evidence is completely counter. Now atheists will try and spin, these arguments, or recycled arguments over and over and over. But amongst the most strongest and potent arguments that they advocate and they forward is the one about explaining the desire and the one about explaining the indeterminism, when they speak about indeterminism and what happens at the subquantum level. These are some of the most strongest arguments they have. Some of the most strongest arguments for science is already declared is pseudoscience. It doesn't exist. It's not something that you would really regard as science. So we really need to have a look, a long, hard think and reflection about what we see, about what we've heard today, and reflect upon that, about whether or not God does actually exist. And I've provided the argument that God indeed does exist beyond question, and that if God doesn't exist, nothing would exist. Nothing would exist, but rather you have an infinite regress, which nothing will ever come into existence. So in that regard, I'm happy to take questions. I'm happy to take them live if you have any questions. Put your hand